Book 1, Chapter 6, Fairy Tales. Monica had quickly put a stop to the secret new language Martin had been teaching David. She'd overheard the Mecha Boy sharing some of the colorful new words with Teddy. She'd appreciated that Teddy had suggested David keep these words to himself, but a boy was a boy, whether flesh or fiber, and Monica had disciplined him soundly. She had known immediately where the language came from, and sought Martin out. He hadn't taken to scolding as humbly as David had, but then she had scolded him a bit more soundly. In the back of her mind, she was glad that he was getting back to his prankish self. This was normal for little boys to do, wasn't it? And David was rather naive, after all. Maybe Martin's playful pranks and teasing would help sophisticate him a little. David would have to get more in the swing of living with the newly reunited Swinton family. He was part of it now. Who knows, Monica thought. Maybe when Martin got better, David would go places with him and his friends. Maybe to the movies or holocades, or the zero-G chambers that were becoming so popular. But the impracticality of this thought became immediately apparent, as images of her little Mecha Boy coming home painted up like a clown, or pantless and dirty from some cruel boyhood initiation, flashed across her mind's eye. Or what if they broke him? She drove that thought out of her head. Monica had been driving a lot of thoughts out of her head lately. Thoughts about David's future. Thoughts about the effect the robot's continual attempts to please her might have on Martin. She'd been ignoring things too, like the fact that her boys didn't really get along that well. She ignored the little ways Martin tried to get David in trouble. She didn't see the way that Martin scoffed at David's programmed innocence and childish manner. She hadn't recognized the effect it had on David when Martin scoffed at him for calling her Mommy instead of Mom, insisting the longer version was for little kids. David had stubbornly refused to use a shorter word, and Martin wouldn't leave him alone about it until Monica intervened. She'd not noticed the flat face that David donned every time Martin was near. The pinched eyebrows that once signified his curiosity now displayed something new in David, something troubled. David's voice was always happy when she was around, so she never noticed the flat way he responded to Martin when she wasn't near, the way he increasingly challenged Martin's implied authority over him. David refused to be a toy. He was a boy. But he was still expected to help Mommy take care of Martin, and he did so dutifully, even though the Orga Boy was often stubborn. There were so many things to do. Martin had to eat and drink a lot of medicines. There were drinks of all different colors, and little pills and bigger ones that Martin had to take at different times of the day. He ate a lot too, a lot more than Mommy or Henry ever did. He was always chewing something. Sometimes he would talk to David when there was something in his mouth. David had a hard time understanding what Martin was saying when he did this. He wanted to walk away from Martin at those times, but he was sure that this would displease Mommy. She'd said that they should be friends, that they were actually brothers. Then, one day when Mommy was showing David some new medicines for Martin, the boy had come into the room. He had something hidden behind his back. "Read to us?" he asked. Monica realized how long it had been since she'd last read a story to her little boy. She'd love to. "What do you have there?" she asked, reaching for the book. Martin handed it to her, and then smiled strangely at David. David did not know "read to us," but Martin had made that face he always made when he did not want Mommy to know he was doing bad things. Monica missed Martin's expression as she read the cover of the book. She smiled at first, realizing it was one of her favorites too. Then her expression slowly changed. She looked at Martin cautiously, and then at David. David did not understand the look on Mommy's face. He read the cover of the book. It said, "Pinocchio" by Carlo Collodi. "David's going to love it," Martin said. Monica ignored the hint of sarcasm in his voice. As soon as the show was over, the showman went into the kitchen, where the lamb, which he was preparing for supper, was slowly turning on a spit in the furnace. Monica read to her two boys. They had come down to the pond and had taken out the boat, and were now floating on the still waters as she read. The boys sat on either side of her, absorbed in the tale. When he saw that there was not enough wood to finish roasting it, he called the Harlequin and the Puncinello. David was entranced by the story. It made pictures in his head, and his brain had to do new things to create the images the words described. But as Mommy read, Martin leaned close to her and began to stroke his fingers along her arm. David watched this for a moment. Then he leaned close to her and duplicated the gesture. He felt immediately better. "He said, 'Bring me in Pinocchio. You'll find him hanging on a nail,'" Monica read. David followed the story carefully. Something in the words was moving him. His mind made some undefined sense of Pinocchio. "He is made of nice dry wood, and I'm sure he'll make a nice fire for my roast." How would Pinocchio get away? Why didn't Geppetto come to find him? Did he love him? David leaned close to Mommy's side. Did she love him? Would she come look for him if he got lost, taken away from her like Pinocchio? Cybertronics could not have imagined the things a simple fairy tale was doing to their creation's mind. As the day dwindled on, they left the pond and walked slowly back to the house. Martin's legs were getting better, and he didn't need the braces anymore, but he moved slowly and had to rest sometimes. That night, as Martin lay in the canopy of his bed, Mommy pulled the book out and continued the story. David was entranced as he sat in his sleeping place on the floor, watching Mommy lay by Martin's side with the book. They were bathed in the soft blue nightlight of the bed. He didn't like the feeling of being so far away from her, especially when Martin was so close. But she had hugged and kissed him before she went to Martin's side, and that would last him for the night. Pinocchio worked until midnight, and instead of making 8 baskets, he made 16, she read. Suddenly, David understood Pinocchio. He worked hard. He worked hard because he wanted love. If Pinocchio worked hard and was obedient, his father would love him. This new connection locked in place in David's mind and gave him something like a thrill. A missing piece of the puzzle had been set in place. David pondered this connection. What was a fairy tale? It was a story. He knew story. A story told what happened, and things that happened were real, because unreal things don't happen. Therefore, a fairy tale must be. Then he went to his bed and fell asleep, and dreamt he saw the fairy, lovely and smiling, who gave him a kiss, saying, "Brave Pinocchio, in return for your good heart, I'll forgive all your past misdeeds. Be good in the future, and you'll be happy." And then the dream ended. David was lost in the words. What was the dream? Was the blue fairy in a dream? David had never known anticipation. Indeed, no mecha had ever felt the thrill this creation was feeling. And Pinocchio awoke, full of amazement. You can imagine how astonished he was when he saw that he was no longer a puppet. Could this really be? But a real boy, just like other boys. Mommy read on, but David heard no more of the story. If he'd had a heart, it would have been racing as quickly as the streams of data that coursed through his unique processor. His brain was alive with this new thing, imagination. A real boy, it said. Imagination had claimed a part of his brain, and there it would nurture itself and grow. A real boy, it repeated over and over. Were he even flesh and blood, he would not have closed his eyes that long night. The tension between David and Martin had been building all day. Martin was annoyed at David's fascination with the story from the day before. He thought the Pinocchio tale would have taken the mecha down a peg or two, but the thing was apparently too dumb to get the joke. All day long it had been asking Mom questions about fairy tales, where they came from, what they mean, what were dreams, and on and on. Martin didn't see how Mom could put up with all that, but at least the thing would shut up once he came into the room. Mom had said that they were like brothers. Ha! As if Martin would have a fiber head for his brother. Things had come to a head at the dinner table that evening when Martin noticed the thing was doing the fake eating again. He had watched the robot pull the same routine every night since he'd been well enough to sit at the table, and he was finally getting tired of it. Mom and Dad were talking grown-up talk about some lady at Dad's job, and the robot was pretending to eat with them. Why couldn't it be like Teddy? At least Teddy knew it was a toy and didn't try to act real. Martin watched carefully as the stupid thing put the spoon to its mouth, pretending to chew, picked up the glass, pretending to drink. It even faked swallowing. What was it going to do next? Pretend to pee? When the mecha realized he was watching, it stopped and fixed Martin with a cold stare. David had been listening to Mommy and Henry talk while he ate. Another part of his brain was processing what Mommy had told him about dreams. Then he'd seen the look on Martin's face. He didn't like it when Martin looked at him that way. He'd been doing it all day. David stopped eating and stared back at Martin. He was getting better at reading the boys' bad faces. When Martin made the mean smile, David knew something was about to happen. Suddenly, Martin knew how to get across his point, the one he'd been trying to make with the Pinocchio story. He took a spoonful of spinach into his mouth while the dumb mecha stared. Then he opened his mouth so the machine could see the food on his tongue. It was working. The mecha watched his every move. Martin chewed dramatically then and swallowed loudly. Then he opened his mouth wide so the dumb thing could see the food was gone. There, his eyes said, that's what eating is. Try that, mecha. He sneered and went back to his meal. From his seat between the boys, Teddy had been watching a quiet confrontation brewing. Mommy and Daddy were too busy talking to be interrupted, and he didn't have the words in his head for these things anyway. He'd been programmed to recognize certain human interactions, especially childish ones. So he knew something was happening, but could not define it yet. He would do his best to not let things get out of control. David stared at the spinach bowl, then back to his empty plate. Was that what made you real? Could that be all it was? What made Martin so special? What was so special about eating? He looked at Martin, and a cold place opened in his brain. Then, in a gesture that unofficially marked a new epoch for Mecha, an almost unnoticed movement, David reached for the spinach bowl. Teddy finally understood what was going on. The bear reached for David's arm and pinned it against the table surface. "You will break," he warned. But David yanked the bowl away and shoveled spinach into his mouth. Then he mimicked Martin's tease and opened his mouth, displaying the unmasticated food. He chewed madly then and shoveled more food into his mouth. David couldn't swallow. He had no need to, so the spinach he forced into his mouth was being crammed down his useless throat, and his chewing was causing it to stream into tiny pressure relief openings in his inner chest, where sensitive equipment regulated his vital functions. Martin joined in on the fun, filling his mouth with the food he usually tried to ignore. Maybe the stupid thing would break. Henry stopped mid-sentence. Monica saw his expression and followed his gaze. To her shock, David's mouth was overflowing with spinach, and the mecha boy was stuffing more in. "Does he eat?" Henry asked urgently, knowing the answer. "I don't think... No, he's not supposed to," Monica said. "Should I get the book?" Henry asked. What the hell kind of malfunction was this? "David, what are you doing?" Monica called to him. But for the first time she could remember, the robot boy ignored her. "David, stop it!" she commanded. When he actually ignored a direct command, she knew something was wrong. According to the manual, David should always obey a direct order, especially one from the imprinter. But none of them knew how useless the manual had become at this point. David was going to show Martin that he could do real stuff too, that he wasn't a scaredy-puss or a wimp like Martin had called him so many times. Each overflowing mouthful pronounced his defiance. Each simulated swallow was a battle cry. "Stop it now, David," Henry commanded. "What would happen if he broke? Cybertronics would not be happy." "David!" he yelled. Monica started on Martin. He was instigating. He should put the fork down now. But it was quite common for real boys to disobey, and Martin was having more fun than he'd had in a long time. Teddy did not understand David's actions. Did he not know food was for real people? The super toy consulted his inner log of toy malfunctions, but could find no reference for this. He looked on curiously, helplessly. Enough. Henry couldn't afford to be responsible for a malfunctioning robot's behavior. He reached out angrily and grabbed the mecha's wrist, surprised at the strength of its resistance. It managed to shove in another mouthful in spite of Henry's grasp. Then suddenly, it just stopped. Monica had leaned over the table to help Henry take the food away, when suddenly David just stopped moving. "David?" Monica said, concerned. The mecha boy looked back at her with troubled eyes. His face went slack, became expressionless. The air was suddenly filled with the scent of burnt garlic. and there was a soft metallic whining sound that came from him, from inside of him. Suddenly, his face began to change. The family gasped as one. David could not move. Something was wrong. He had no apparatus with which to taste, but he could feel the food against the sensory receptors in his mouth. Inside, he felt hot. Why hadn't he listened to Teddy's warning? What had he been doing? He had no word for the compulsion that had driven his actions. Mecca had never been compelled before this moment. He looked to Mommy for assistance. He wanted to run to her. She must be able to make it better somehow. But he could not move. As he watched her face, the colors became wrong, blurry. "Help!" his mind screamed in silence from a paralyzed body. "Mommy, I'm broken! Broken!" The family watched helplessly as their Mecca's face seemed to melt like wax on one side. His cheek drooped down, and his eye socket displayed a glint of the silvery gray metal that comprised his Mecca infrastructure. Even Martin, who had secretly hoped to cause the Mecca some pain, had not expected a result of this severity. Henry was certain the director would demote him. Monica watched in fascinated horror as David's face grotesquely malfunctioned. "Oh, my little robot boy," she thought. "What have you done to yourself? What have you done?" "Smell that garlic," one of the techs said as he pried a motion regulator clip loose from David's chest. The transparent clip was almost weightless in his hand. The spinach in which it was coated weighed more. He carefully cleaned the spinach off the clip with a small sucking device, and then set the irreplaceable piece of David's anatomy in a cleaning solution until he was ready to put it back. Monica was standing above David, who was laying on a table while the techs operated. She held his upraised hand and watched the proceedings with nervous anticipation. The men had arrived in record time after Henry had called. They had laid the frozen mecha on a hastily constructed work area. Then they had quickly sliced into the small robot's chest cavity and clamped him open. He'd been stiff as a rock when they arrived. Every piece of equipment that controlled his physical interactions with the world around him had been locked in an automatic attempt to defend itself against the moisture created by the spinach. But the errant little robot was moving now. It was talking softly to the woman in which it had been imprinted. The tech was glad to see she was here. He'd been told these experimental models could get strange if the imprinter wasn't around. He smiled up at the woman to make sure she was okay. She looked stunned by the process. These things must be pretty good simulators to make people feel so strong about them. He knew how to fix the things, but not entirely what they did or how. David was, after all, a secret. The other tech winced at the sight of the green goop that lined David's insides. There was some expensive equipment in here. More than he made in a year. What in the hell had the thing been trying to do, anyway? Oh well, he shouldn't be surprised. He'd been around long enough to know that when these things went, they tended to really go overboard. He'd seen some weird stuff in his time. Stuff even the research guys upstairs wouldn't believe. But this was something new. Cybertronics was a good company to work for. Good money, great hours, and definitely interesting projects. This David thing was supposed to be top of the line. Most of his primary functions were still secret, even to him. But the prototype had just shoved itself full of spinach, and that decision was apparently not due to some processing malfunction. What the hell was going on? Even a dumb toy knew that eating was for orgas only. But then again, the thing had been made to simulate a little kid, after all. Maybe it was supposed to do stupid, unpredictable stuff. But dangerous stuff? "Hey, kid," the tech said, getting David's attention. David looked away from Mommy, down over his open chest cavity at the man who held part of his insides. "You made a real mess of yourself," the tech said, and held up a spinach-coated clip for David to see. "Spinach is for rabbits, people, and Popeye, not robo-boys," the man said. Martin watched him across the room. Mom had really laid into him while they waited for the technicians to arrive. Dad had tried to come to his rescue, but she was having none of it. She was pretty pissed off. But Martin didn't see how it was his fault. The robot was the one who had started eating. He was just trying to show what the difference is between them. He'd made his point, thrusting his chin up in a manner he'd inherited from her. But Mom had scolded him for not obeying her commands to stop. Now it was supposed to be his fault because he had been instigating David. Damn Mecca. Henry had sighed relief when the project support team had arrived. They'd taken a look at the robot and told him not to worry. Apparently this wasn't a major issue. He would have rather had the guys take the cursed thing with them, but Monica wouldn't hear of it. And of course it would have to be destroyed. He'd assured the director they'd take good care of it, so as long as the thing wasn't totaled, it was theirs. Henry had wanted to avoid any incidents with the main office and asked if it would be possible to keep this off the main log. The lead man had replied that his job was more important than Henry's embarrassment, but agreed to write it in as a mechanical malfunction. He really didn't know what else to call it. Monica looked away from what was happening on the table. She wasn't comfortable watching the men operate. David wasn't flesh and blood, she knew that. But he was still her little boy, and seeing his insides, even though they were antiseptic optic clips and fibrous metal alloy, still wasn't an easy sight. She hadn't wanted to watch at all, but one of the techs had requested her presence. He wanted her to hold David's hand. If the imprinter wasn't there when David became unlocked, he'd explained, the mecha might behave unpredictably. So she was the imprinter. Was that her title? She had reluctantly held David's hand, and indeed when the malfunction that had locked him up was corrected, David had sprung into motion, his arms desperately pawing the air, and his legs kicking as if he was running from something. He had been repeating an urgent plea over and over. "Help me, broke! Help me, broke!" And Monica had reassured him by squeezing his too real hand to calm him. The mecha looked up and focused on her, and then he'd smiled and relaxed. She had too. David had been horrified during the time he could not move. He couldn't see anything either, except muddy blurs. But that was over now, and Mommy was here with him. He looked down and saw himself cut open. He felt strange sensations in him as the men pulled machinery from his body and clicked it back into place. Things were going off and on inside of his legs and arms. He looked up and saw Mommy's face, creased in concern and worry. This made him feel good somehow. She was worried. That meant she loved him, didn't it? He would calm her. "It's okay, Mommy," he said. "It doesn't hurt." Monica looked at the mecha. What had it done to make her worry so? His face was so innocent, so vulnerable. He didn't know what he was doing to her heart. She couldn't deal with this anymore. She didn't want any more loss. She let go of David's hand suddenly and fled to the back of the room. One of the techs looked up as she rushed away. "Looks like we lost our imprinter," he sighed to the other. Then he looked at David's face. "Now you just lay still and behave yourself," he ordered. Henry followed Monica to the dark corner of her retreat. He knew what an impact the mecha was having on her, but she shouldn't let this thing control her life now. They had their real son back. "Monica," he started hesitantly, "maybe it would be better if we let them take it," was how he was going to finish. But she silenced him with an impatient wave of her hand. She couldn't bear any more loss. Her heart had had enough. But David was so vulnerable. Why hadn't they made him like other boys? More resilient, not so sensitive, so needy. She immediately felt guilty at this thought. David loved her purely, without reservation. Was his love real? Or was it just a result of clever programming? Something told her, something deep inside beyond logic's restraints, that David's emotions were more than that David himself was somehow more than that. She walked around Henry and strode dutifully back to the table where the men were working on the little robot that had stolen her heart. She'd made a commitment to David, just as he was committed to her. She would not abandon him. Once at the table, she took David's hand in her own and smiled down at him. "I'm here, honey," she whispered. From where Martin stood, he could not hear his mother whisper these tender words to the mecha. But he'd seen the look on her face. He'd seen the way she held its hand. What was going on here? Why all the special attention for a damn toy? What was all this talk about imprinting? His face grew grim as his mind began to work. Why had that robot really been brought here? The possibilities were dark paths down which he feared to tread. But there was only one thing that was important for now. This was his mom, and he was her son. The only one. "If you do something really, really special for me," Martin whispered conspiratorially in the dark bedroom, "let's call it a special mission. Then I'll go tell Mommy that I love you, and then she'll love you too." He'd gotten the idea from the movie they watched after the men who fixed David left. Martin had been further infuriated then by the way the mecha snuggled up with Mom on the couch. He'd seen this behavior before, but thought nothing of it at the time. He thought it was only a program. Even Teddy would do that occasionally. But now, after the scene in the kitchen, those memories had a new, darker meaning. David looked up from the game he was playing. His face was working normally now, and he could see everything just like before. He was happy about the way Martin was acting now, even though he was hesitant to trust the boy completely. But Martin had let him play with his copter simulator game, something he'd never done before. He'd even put his arms around David's shoulders when they walked upstairs after Mommy said it was time to sleep. After the men from Cybertronics had left, Mommy had scolded them both for acting badly and had made a speech to them about being good to each other. She had said that David was now Martin's little brother and that Martin should look out for him. And he should look out for Martin. Now Martin was suggesting something that might help him win Mommy's love. He came down from the bed and sat on the floor across from his big brother. "What shall I do?" he asked cautiously. "You'll have to promise, and then I'll tell you," Martin said. David processed this. A promise was a serious issue, not to be taken lightly. He offered a counter-proposal. "You have to tell me, and then I'll promise." Teddy was in the corner of the room, quietly sewing closed another tear in the fabric of his old body. After Mommy's speech, the boys had seemed to get along, and Martin had been very quiet while they watched television with Mommy. But Teddy was listening very carefully to this conversation as he worked on himself. Martin realized the mecha wasn't too good at this. "I want a lock of Mommy's hair," he said. "I'll share it with you, and if you had it and wore it, she might love you even more. Like the princess in the movie, when she had the princess hair and the necklace thing, he loved her. Remember?" Of course David remembered. He never forgot anything, but this was not right. This was like sneaking. Sneaking was wrong. How come Martin always insisted on doing wrong things? "We can ask her," he suggested. No, it has to be a secret mission," Martin countered quickly, and then whispered the details of David's mission. "You must sneak into Mommy's bedroom in the middle of the night and chop it off." Teddy looked up as he heard this. What was Martin up to now? Was he playing bad games again? Alarms went off in David's head. This was more than just wrong. This was very bad. It went against everything that had ever been put into his brain. He was simply not supposed to sneak around taking things without permission, especially Mommy's hair. "I'm not allowed, Martin," he said. "You promised," the other boy said, smiling that particular smile. He leaned close to David then, and his eyes sharpened. "You said tell me, and I'll promise. Didn't you?" David was trapped. Was this a game? Had he made a promise? He reanalyzed all the statements between he and Martin, but his logic processor could not find a way out. He had made a promise. A bad one. Mommy's room was dark. David had never been here this deep into the night. He walked slowly, navigating the dark room carefully, the scissors that Martin had given him held in hand. He was not uncomfortable in this stealth. Slow, cautious movements had never been a problem for him. Martin had told him where to find Mommy, what side of the bed she usually slept on, although David really didn't need that information. His vision was heightened in the dark. It was a standard survival feature with most mecha. He made his way slowly to the bedside, alarm still ringing in his brain. Then he found her, and stood quietly by the bed. He could hear Henry's rumbling breath on the other side. Mommy was sleeping. She was so still. What was this sleeping? Why did real people have to do it? David knelt beside the bed. His head was full of contradictory feelings. In a secret place in his mind, the place where her face was a continual source of light and warmth, something in him cried out. This was wrong, and he knew it. He'd been tricked into making a promise, but inside he knew he didn't really have to obey Martin. He was here because he wanted Mommy's lock of hair, because he wanted her to love him more than she did Martin, to love him more than she did Henry. because he did not want to share her with anyone else. Teddy had warned him. Teddy had told him that it was against the rules, and their job was to obey the rules. But what did Teddy know? He was just a toy, a dumb little toy from a box in the closet. David leaned over the bed. His calm facade was typical of his mecha nature, but inside his thoughts were chaotic. Mommy was facing him, so he had to lean across her to get to her hair, which was spilled across the pillow behind her head. He placed his knee on the bed and reached for the prize. David pulled back quickly as Mommy made a sudden movement in her sleep. Almost. He had almost woken her. If he'd had a heart, it would have been pounding in his chest. If he'd had breath, it would have been caught in his throat. For that one moment, his brain functioned clearly, and he saw how stupid and dangerous this secret mission was. But she was still again, and with great excitement, David saw that she had turned her head, so that her hair was dangling over the edge of the bed. The rational part of his brain, the one Cybertronics had built, was forced into the back seat as this new part of his mind took control once more. This part of him that had been growing slowly ever since Mommy brought him to life. David moved cautiously, placing the scissors over the dangling strands of Mommy's hair. It was smooth and glistened in the faint light. In her fleeting dream, David had been yelling her name, calling out to her from across some great invisible expanse. But Martin had been at her side, looking at her accusingly. He'd spoken no words, but his face had made plain his thoughts. You tried to replace me with a toy, didn't you? Didn't you? The dream had woken her with a sudden jolt, and she turned and felt something against the bed. She'd opened her eyes to see something thin and shiny being reflected in the faint light from the windows of the room. If what Martin said was real, then all David had to do was keep her hair by his heart, and she would love him. All he had to do was grab a lock of hair and close the scissors. Henry opened his eyes when he heard his wife yell. He saw the mecha leaning against the bed, silhouetted against the white walls behind him. Was that a knife? Then he heard the metallic snick and realized what had happened. David, what the hell are you doing? He roared. He jumped over his wife and grabbed the thing by the shoulders. What in the hell are you doing, David? He repeated, shaking the thing violently. Why, David? Why did you do that? God damn it, answer me! David recoiled in fear and dropped the scissors. Henry shook him violently and yelled some of the bad words like the ones that Martin had tried to teach him. With his night vision, he could see clearly the anger in Henry's face, and there was a lot of it. Henry was very angry. Monica rose quickly and grabbed her husband's arm. Henry, you're hurting him, she said. Henry was shaking the boy violently. His little mecha head was rolling back and forth on his neck. How could he expect him to answer? Henry, you're hurting him, she yelled. But Henry didn't hear her. Damn it, David! Don't pull a silent routine on me again! Why? He yelled, and shook the robot harder, angered by its refusal to answer. He'd had enough of this damn machine. First a stupid spinach trick, and now this. Why? He yelled. Monica grabbed her husband's arm, frightened by his escalating violence. You'll break him, she yelled. Henry stopped shaking the mecha. She was right. He couldn't afford to replace it, could he? He released it, and it fell to the floor, shielding itself from him in simulated fright. Before, Henry had been chastened by the mecha's innocent pose. But now, as the thing cowered before him, he felt a touch of satisfaction. David's eyes were wide with fright and surprise. His mouth was open with an utterance that never came. Henry's violence was unprecedented in his life. He had nowhere in his brain to flee from such a thing. He cowered as the man glared at him in the dark. He hadn't been disobeying Henry's commands to answer. He'd simply not known the answer. Why had he broke the most basic rule to any of his kind and endangered Norga? There was only one reason. Henry? David said weakly, frazzled by the manhandling. I wanted Mommy to love me. More. Henry's eyes were angry, and there was something else there. Something that David had not seen before, not even in Martin's ambiguous smiles. Suddenly Monica moaned. Oh my God, she said, covering her face. Henry turned to her. He'd deal with the mecha later. What's wrong, honey? He asked urgently. My eye, I think is bleeding, she cried. They rose from the bed and rushed to the bathroom where David heard them knocking things around in a frantic search of the cabinets. Henry was swearing some more, and Mommy's frantic cries pounded against David's brain. What had he done? Mommy would never love him now. He had hurt her. In his fear and self-recrimination, he did not see the lock of hair that fell from the bed where it had been cut from Mommy's mane. It slipped over the folds of blanket and wafted to the floor, descending slowly, alighting silently on the carpet, perhaps to be forgotten and discarded forever. Teddy watched the hair fall. He'd been standing quietly in the hallway while David was on his mission. He'd come into the room after the commotion had passed to see David sitting silently, staring into the darkness, while Mommy and Daddy talked urgently in the bathroom. He regarded the fallen hair. Symbols were far beyond Teddy's level of processing, but he knew something had changed, something important, and the hair somehow seemed to encapsulate the meaning of this change. He stood over the curled strands, in his own way pondering their significance. What now? From the darkness of his room, Martin had heard Mom scream and Dad cursing at David. At first he'd laughed. "Gotcha, you stupid fiberhead," he'd whispered to himself. The taste of revenge had been sweet, but short-lived. He'd heard David's pathetic whine about wanting Mommy to love him, and that should have made him feel even better. It should have made his night. He should have reveled in his triumph. But it hadn't, and he didn't. He heard Mom's agonized moans and Dad's urgent questions. Their footfalls were heavy as they raced into the bathroom. His immediate thought had been, that damn robot better not say anything. Then he realized that he had a part in this, that he might have caused Mom to get hurt. Some new feeling tugged at his conscience. It was the first struggling effort of a young mind to break away from the selfishness of childhood. But he didn't know that. He just knew that it felt bad. If something bad had happened to Mom, he'd never forgive himself. Why had he sent David to do this thing? What had he been thinking? What had he done?